There is a particular kind of silence that is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of a system that has decided what will not be spoken and has made that decision permanent. The men who lived inside it did not experience it as oppression. They experienced it as structure, as the natural order of a world that had its own logic, its own hierarchy, and its own method of ensuring that the logic and the hierarchy were preserved. By the mid-1980s, that system had a single architect. His name appeared in no organizational chart. His voice was recorded on no surveillance tape. His instructions existed in no document that a federal agent could retrieve, no telephone conversation that a wiretap could capture. He communicated through proximity, through careful meetings in locations that changed regularly, through the careful management of information that never moved further than it needed to. The system worked. And for a period that lasted longer than most people in law enforcement believed was possible. The Bonanno crime family of New York operated under a structure of silence so complete that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the most resourced law enforcement agency in the world, could not find a way inside it. This is not a story about luck. It is a story about design. To understand what Joseph Massino built in the years after the Brasco disaster, you have to understand what he was building against. The other four New York families, the Gambinos, the Genovese, the Lucchese, the Colombo, were, through the 1980s, being systematically dismantled by a series of federal prosecutions that represented the most comprehensive law enforcement assault on organized crime in American history. The FBI had learned that the key to defeating an organization was not to arrest its foot soldiers, but to remove its leadership in a single coordinated prosecution that made rebuilding impossible. The commission trial of 1985 and 1986 was the culmination of this strategy. The bosses and senior leaders of 4 of the 5 families sat in a federal courtroom and were convicted of running a criminal enterprise that had, for decades, operated with the quiet approval of entire industries. The sentences effectively removed an entire generation of organized crime leadership from the street. The Bonanno family was not among the defendants. The reason had nothing to do with their virtue. It had everything to do with the Brasco operation. Because the Bonannos had been expelled from the Commission's shared enterprises as punishment for allowing an FBI agent inside their organization, they were not participating in the syndicated rackets that formed the core of the Commission trial indictments. The prosecution was built on evidence of participation. The Bonannos, stripped of that participation, were not included. The disaster that had humiliated them had also, in the most precise and accidental way, saved them. At the time, the other families did not see it this way. They saw a pariah organization that had lost its standing and deserved its exile. They saw an organization that had been functionally destroyed by its own incompetence. They were watching the wrong thing. While the other 4 families were being led into federal courtrooms by men they trusted who turned out to be cooperating with the government, while their command structures were being disrupted and their assets were being seized and their bosses were receiving sentences measured in decades, the Bonanno family under Joseph Massino was rebuilding, quietly, methodically, with a precision that the other families, occupied with their own collapsing world, did not have the attention to observe. The pattern would only become visible later. What Massino implemented in those years was not simply a set of rules. Rules can be learned. Rules can be tested. Rules can be broken by a man who believes the risk is acceptable. What Massino built was something more fundamental. He built a culture, a set of understood and internalized expectations so deeply embedded in the day-to-day operation of the family that deviation from them did not feel like rule-breaking. It felt like a kind of insanity. The first principle was visibility, specifically, its elimination. The social clubs were gone. The social clubs had been the lifeblood of the traditional mafia social world, the places where men gathered to play cards, drink coffee, conduct business, and maintain the web of personal relationships that held the organization together. They were also, from a surveillance perspective, extraordinarily valuable. A federal agent parked across the street with a camera and enough time could, over the course of weeks, reconstruct an organizational chart simply by noting who arrived, who they spoke to, how long they stayed, and who they left with. The clubs were maps. Massino eliminated the maps. In their place, meetings happened in motion, in cars, at construction sites where ambient noise defeated directional microphones, in diners where two men sitting over coffee looked identical to 10,000 other conversations happening simultaneously across New York at any given hour. The locations changed. The timing was unpredictable. The meetings were short. There was nothing to photograph that could be used to construct a pattern. The second principle was communication, specifically, its reduction to the essential minimum. The telephone was not merely avoided. It was treated as a weapon that the enemy already held. A man who had something to say that mattered found a way to say it in person. If that was not possible, he waited. The discipline required to do this to resist the natural human impulse to pick up a telephone and resolve an ambiguity with a call that would take 2 minutes was not a small thing. Most people cannot maintain it under ordinary conditions, under the conditions of a criminal organization, where decisions needed to be made quickly, and the consequences of delay were sometimes measured in money and sometimes in something more permanent. It required a level of self-control that Massino demanded and enforced. The third principle was structure, specifically, the elimination of any structure that the Bureau could observe. Under Massino, the traditional model of the mafia boss as the accessible center of a visible network was finished. He did not hold court. He did not summon captains to his presence in groups where the gathering itself would signal something. He met with each captain individually, and those meetings happened in circumstances that generated no observable pattern. The organizational chart that existed inside the Bonanno family could not be reconstructed from the outside because there was nothing on the outside to reconstruct it from. A federal agent later described the experience of trying to investigate the Bonanno family under Massino as the experience of watching a building from across a street and seeing no windows, no doors, no architectural features that revealed anything about the internal structure. The building was clearly there. What happened inside it was invisible. There was a second layer to what Massino built, and it operated below the level of operational protocol. It operated at the level of psychology. The men inside the Bonanno family did not simply follow Massino's rules because the rules were enforced. They followed them because the enforcement was so complete and so consistent that deviation had become genuinely inconceivable. The hierarchy of consequences was clear. Those who produced were protected. Those who created uncertainty were first isolated and then, if the uncertainty persisted, eliminated, not physically. In every case, Massino understood that unnecessary violence created problems of its own: the bodies, the missing persons reports, the families that asked questions, the investigators who noticed patterns in disappearances. He deployed economic consequences as a primary tool. A man whose earning power was stripped, whose crews were reassigned, whose rackets were redistributed to others had been functionally destroyed. He still breathed. He still ate. He was present enough to serve as a reminder to everyone else of what happened when the rules were not followed. This was, in its way, more effective than killing. A dead man is a cautionary tale that fades with time. A live man with nothing is a walking demonstration that continues indefinitely. But the willingness to go further was understood. It was not spoken. It did not need to be. One of the men who later cooperated with federal investigators described working inside the organization during this period as living inside a structure where the walls were invisible but were also, somehow, at every moment, present. You did not feel imprisoned. You felt secure. The security and the imprisonment were the same thing. Most people, over time, stopped noticing the difference. This is how effective structures of control maintain themselves. They require only that the initial enforcement be decisive enough that deviation becomes, in the minds of everyone inside, genuinely inconceivable. The Bonanno family in the late 1980s was a structure of this kind. From the inside, it felt like order. From the outside, it was invisible. From the perspective of a federal agent trying to investigate it, it was a problem without an obvious solution. Jack Stubing led the Bureau's organized crime investigations against the Bonanno family during this period, and his descriptions of those years carry the particular frustration of a skilled professional confronting an adversary who has anticipated every approach. The standard tools of organized crime investigation had been developed over decades, and they were calibrated to the behavior of organizations that operated in predictable ways. Surveillance of social clubs, telephone interception, the cultivation of informants within the organization, approach through the slow building of relationships that exploited financial pressure, legal exposure, or both. Against the Bonannos under Massino, none of these tools worked. There were no social clubs to surveil. The telephones were silent on anything of value, and the informant cultivation that had produced results against every other family that had placed Pistone inside the organization a decade earlier could not get traction, because the fear inside the organization was too complete and too well maintained to allow a potential informant to imagine that speaking to the Bureau was a survivable option. Stubing visited Massino at his legitimate business, a catering company that operated lunch trucks at construction sites across the city. The encounter was, by Stubbing's account, among the more unsettling of his career. Massino knew his name. He knew the names of other agents assigned to the investigation. He could describe their vehicles. He had partial license plate numbers. He understood, in technical detail, every surveillance methodology the Bureau had deployed against organized crime figures in New York, and he had built his operational protocols to neutralize each one. This was not luck. Massino had studied the Bureau the way the Bureau studied organized crime. He had access to court records, trial transcripts, and the published accounts of prosecutions that had succeeded against other families. He understood that the FBI's methods were not secret. They were, in a sense, public knowledge for anyone willing to put in the time to learn them. He had put in the time. The result was an organization that a federal investigator could observe from the outside and confirm was criminal in its fundamental nature, but could not penetrate by any method that had worked before. One of the agents assigned to the Bonanno investigation during this period later described a conversation with a retired federal prosecutor who had spent years building organized crime cases in New York. The prosecutor looked at the surveillance reports on the Bonanno family, the thin files, the blank spaces where intelligence should have been, and said something that stayed with the agent for a long time. He said, "The other families gave us patterns. This one gives us nothing. And nothing is harder to prosecute than nothing." That absence was not accidental. It had been designed. The financial architecture of what Massino built during this period is, in some ways, the most revealing part of the story. Criminal enterprises generate cash, and cash, in large amounts, is a problem that every organized crime family eventually faces. It exists outside the systems the legitimate economy uses to account for value. Move it wrong, and it leaves a trail. Massino had studied the financial trails that had brought down other bosses. He built his revenue architecture around that knowledge. The Bonanno family, under his leadership, developed revenue streams that were, by the standards of organized crime, unusually well-structured. Loan sharking generated cash in small, regular amounts that could be absorbed into the legitimate economy through any number of channels, a restaurant that appeared to do consistent business, a construction subcontractor whose invoices were always paid promptly and whose records showed a steady volume of work, illegal gambling operations, particularly high-volume bookmaking on sports events, produced similar revenue streams that could be distributed through multiple legitimate businesses. Narcotics presented a different calculation. The volumes of cash generated by drug trafficking were large enough to create financial signatures that were difficult to disguise. Massino had an ambivalent relationship with the narcotics trade. The traditional mafia prohibition on drug dealing the rule, formalized by the commission, that members were not to involve themselves in narcotics had been eroding for decades. By the 1980s, most organized crime families were involved in drug distribution to varying degrees. Regardless of what their formal rules stated, the Bonanno family was not an exception. What Massino controlled was not whether drugs were moved, but how the money generated by that movement was managed. The crews that operated drug networks were kept at a deliberate organizational distance from the family's core command structure. If a crew was rolled up by federal investigators, the connections that would lead from that arrest upward through the hierarchy were minimized. At the time, this appeared to work. The cracks would come from a different direction. By the early 1990s, the landscape of New York organized crime had changed dramatically in ways that consolidated Messino's position beyond what he could have anticipated when he began rebuilding after the Brasco disaster. The commission trial convictions had removed or incapacitated the leadership of 4 of the 5 families. The Gambino family had lost Paul Castellano, who was murdered outside a Manhattan steakhouse in 1985, and his successor John Gotti had ultimately been convicted in 1992 and sentenced to life in prison. The Genovese family had seen multiple senior figures prosecuted and imprisoned. The Lucchese family was in legal chaos. The Colombo family was engaged in a violent internal conflict that produced bodies on both sides and attracted the kind of sustained law enforcement attention that made any business activity difficult. The Bonanno family was untouched. Messino walked out of federal custody in November 1992, his earlier racketeering sentence predating the period of his full control, having been served and stepped into a landscape where every other major organized crime boss was either imprisoned, under active prosecution, or operating under conditions so constrained by federal oversight that effective leadership was nearly impossible. The FBI gave him a name, The Last Dawn. It was meant as a statement about the state of the law enforcement campaign against organized crime. Every other major boss had fallen. Messino was the only one left standing. In the context in which it was used, the title was a form of acknowledgement from an adversary, recognition that the man at the center of the Bonanno family had built something that had, so far, resisted everything the Bureau had brought against it. The FBI's naming of him was, in its way, the most complete confirmation he could have received that the system was working. What the system looked like from inside the organization in those years is partially reconstructible from the testimony that eventually emerged when the walls finally began to come down. The accounts are consistent in their broad outlines, even where they diverge in detail. The family was smaller than it had been at its peak. This was partly a product of the Brasco damage and partly a deliberate choice. Messino did not seek to expand membership aggressively. Growth creates vulnerability. Every new member is a potential informant. Every expansion requires communication, and communication creates exposure. The family that Messino ran was lean, insular, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. New members, the process of formally initiating a new-made man, were rare and the subject of extraordinary scrutiny. The traditional ceremony of induction, in which a recruit swore an oath over a Burning Saints card and was formally welcomed into the family, continued. But the vetting that preceded it had been redesigned. A candidate spent years as an associate before induction was considered. The sponsoring member's judgment was assessed not just on the candidate's performance, but on the sponsor's willingness to stake his own position on the reliability of the man he was bringing in. If the sponsored member proved unreliable, the consequences for the sponsor were severe. The discipline extended to behavior in prison, where members of organized crime families spend significant portions of their professional lives. The traditional rule against cooperation with the government was not simply stated, it was enforced through a combination of threat and practical management. A member facing prosecution could expect financial support for his family while he served his sentence, provided he maintained his silence. The support was not framed as a payment for cooperation with the organization's rules. It was framed as a demonstration of the family's care for its members. The distinction was meaningful. A man who understood himself to be receiving a payment in exchange for silence was in a transactional relationship with his organization. A man who understood himself to be receiving care because his organization valued him was in a relationship that felt like belonging. The difference between a transaction and a relationship is not small. It is, in many cases, the difference between a structure that holds and one that breaks. But there was something in the design of what Messino built that contained, from the beginning, its own limitation, and that limitation was not visible from inside the organization, which is precisely why it was so consequential. A system built on fear is not the same as a system built on loyalty. In the short run, they produce identical behavior. From the outside, both silences look alike. From the inside, however, they are different in a way that matters enormously over time. A man who is loyal will hold under pressure because his silence is an expression of something he values. A man who is afraid will hold under pressure only for as long as the thing he fears remains more threatening than the alternative. The moment the calculation shifts, the moment the federal government offers a man something that his organization cannot match, the moment a prison sentence becomes long enough and certain enough that the abstract threat of organizational retribution becomes less real than the concrete reality of the years ahead, the silence breaks. Massino understood this intellectually. He had studied institutional failure with unusual precision. He knew that the code of silence was not self-sustaining. He knew that it required active maintenance, constant reinforcement, and the demonstrated willingness to act on its enforcement. What he may not have fully understood was that no level of enforcement, however precise and however consistent, could convert fear into loyalty. He could make the consequences of speaking terrible. He could not make the consequences of silence feel like something worth protecting. These are not the same thing. The 1990s were, by almost any external measure, the period of Massino's greatest power. The other families were in disarray. The Bureau's Bonanno squad had been rebuilt after years of reduced attention, but it was working against an organization that had specifically designed itself to resist the methods the Bureau knew how to use. Revenue was flowing. The family had rebuilt its membership to a functional level. The operations that Vitali had maintained through Massino's earlier incarceration continued to produce income. In those years, the men closest to Massino later described a boss who moved through his world with the particular quality of a man who had solved a problem that others had not been able to solve. Not arrogance, exactly. Something more contained, a confidence that came not from personality, but from evidence. He had built something and it was working. The FBI could not touch him. The commission that had expelled the Bonannos was gone, its members in prison or dead. The other families were dependent, in various degrees, on Massino's goodwill. He was, in every practical sense, the dominant organized crime figure in New York, and the system that had produced this dominance was, to those inside it, something that felt permanent. This is the particular illusion that successful systems generate. The longer they work, the more self-evidently correct they appear. The members of an organization that has sustained itself through 2 decades of federal pressure, that has outlasted the prosecutions that destroyed its competitors, that has maintained its income streams and its command structure and its code of silence in the face of everything the government has brought against it, those members do not experience the possibility of failure as real. They experience their system as proven. Proven systems feel different from ordinary systems. They feel permanent. Nothing is permanent. There was one murder during these years that sits differently from the others in Massino's record, not because of its method or its victim or the circumstances under which it was carried out, but because of what it meant structurally and because of the specific way it connected to what would eventually destroy everything Massino had built. His name was Gerlando Sciascia. He was known within the family as George from Canada, a reference to his role as the primary liaison between the Bonanno family's operations in New York and the related Montreal-based criminal network that operated under the family's broader umbrella. He was experienced, capable, and well-regarded by members on both sides of the border. He was also, by the mid-1990s, accumulating influence that Massino found uncomfortable. The logic that governed Massino's organizational decisions was consistent. Power within the family was a resource to be managed, not distributed. A subordinate who became too capable, too well-connected, too independently powerful was not simply a successful member. He was a potential rival. And, in the organizational logic that Massino had internalized, a potential rival was a threat that had to be addressed before it became an actual one. Sciascia was murdered in 1999. His body was found on a street in the Bronx. At the time, the murder appeared to be one of a series of organizational decisions made by a boss maintaining control of his organization. In retrospect, it was the decision that would eventually provide federal prosecutors with the specific charge that changed every calculation Massino would subsequently make. In 1994, federal legislation had expanded the reach of capital punishment to include homicides committed in furtherance of racketeering enterprises. Under this statute, a conviction for a murder ordered within the context of organized crime activity was punishable by death. The Sayashia murder fell within this statute. The man who had built the most sophisticated security architecture in the history of American organized crime had, in making a decision that followed perfectly from his own organizational logic, created the instrument of his own destruction. At the time, none of this was visible. The pattern would only become visible later. What is perhaps most striking about the period of Massino's dominance, when it is examined from the perspective of what eventually followed, is how ordinary it looks. A man ran a criminal organization in New York. He ran it carefully, methodically, with a level of operational discipline that was unusual. He built an institutional culture in which silence was treated as a structural requirement rather than an individual preference. He enforced that culture consistently and without mercy when it was violated. For nearly 2 decades, it worked. The men inside the organization woke up every day in a world that functioned according to rules they understood. The money moved, the operations continued, the family maintained itself. Outside, the FBI tried to find a way in and could not. The methods that had worked against every other major organized crime family in New York did not work against this one. The Bureau rebuilt its Bonanno squad. It deployed surveillance. It tried to cultivate informants. Nothing produced the opening that would have allowed a prosecution to proceed. Inside, there was no obvious reason to believe this would ever change. The structure held, the silence held, and Massino continued to do what he had always done, working quietly, making no mistakes that anyone could see. But systems built on fear have a property that systems built on loyalty do not. They are stable until the moment they are not. A loyal man who is facing pressure will hold past the point where the rational calculation suggests holding is wise, because loyalty is not rational. It is the suspension of calculation in favor of something that feels more important. A frightened man has no such suspension. He holds as long as the fear holds. And fear, unlike loyalty, can be replaced. A federal indictment carries its own fear. A sentence measured in decades carries its own fear. The government, if it finds the right pressure point, can offer something that the organization cannot match. Massino's system had no answer to that. It had never needed one, because in all the years of its operation, no one had found the pressure point. Not yet.